When grains were first grown for food thousands of years ago, a fortunate byproduct was discovered. When these grains got wet, they would ferment. This process of fermentation had the ability to transform water into a very palatable drink, and so the first beer had then been discovered. Ancient Sumerians were cultivating grains thousands of years ago, and according to one theory, the grains were used to make beer before bread ever entered the picture, thus making beer one of mankind's oldest beverages. The discovery of ancient tools potentially designed for beer brewing supports this theory. Beer might be the Sumerians' greatest contribution to the world. I guess maybe written language and a number system would be up there too, but I think beer is probably the best one. But the Sumerians loved beer so much that they had a goddess of beer and brewing named Ninkasi. In the year 1800 BCE, a hymn was written for Ninkasi that doubled as a beer recipe. Because it was written in song, the recipe was easy for the average beer drinker to memorize if they didn't know how to read. It's also the oldest beer recipe ever discovered. The ancient Egyptians were also fanatical about their beer. They believed that beer brewing knowledge was a gift from the god Osiris, and they incorporated the drink into their religious ceremonies. There's even historical evidence that the Egyptians taught the Greeks how to make beer, and it was very popular in both ancient Greece and ancient Rome until wine took over as their favorite drink. It infiltrated other parts of Egyptian culture as well. Beer was so common that the laborers who built the pyramids of Giza were given daily rations amounting to 10 pints of the stuff. It was also served at celebrations in Egypt, where overindulging was not only accepted, but encouraged. As far as etiquette was concerned, leaving a party when you could still walk straight was considered rude in this ancient Egyptian culture. In time, beer moved north and west across Europe, and about 2,000 years ago, brewing was a popular cottage industry in Belgium. Following the demise of the Roman Empire, the church started to step into the void. Maybe a surprise to some, but the coming of Christianity saw a tremendous increase in the brewing of beer, largely because monks played such a large role in the production. People lived in closed communities, often with a very sketchy water supply, and there was a constant risk of illness. The time-honored advice not to drink the water was in fact very sound, so beer was drunk instead, and in very large quantities at that. Monks lived pretty frugal lives overall, particularly during fasting periods, but fortunately for them, consuming liquids did not break the fast. Saint Benedict, who lived from 480 to 547, is credited as being the father of Western monasticism. His Benedictine rules defined the standards for life in a monastery and were followed widely throughout Europe. One rule was that monks should provide travelers with something to eat and drink. As a result, during the Middle Ages, monasteries everywhere became stopping-off places for weary travelers, who in turn shared the monks' often meager food and particularly their robust and sustaining beers. In some parts of the West Flanders in Belgium, a glass of beer is still referred to as a sandwich in a glass. The practice evolved, and the monks eventually began to sell their beer in what was rather like medieval pubs. Today, brewing is more of a science than an art, but this was not always the case. For centuries, brewers invoked the names of the patron saints to ensure that their brew was good. Often the beer failed to live up to such heavenly standards, and a scapegoat had to be found. Sometimes it was blamed on evil spirits, and specifically on brew witches or beer witches. The last known burning of a beer witch was in late 1500s. In addition to the monastic brewing of beer, it was also brewed on a domestic scale. This was particularly true in Britain, after Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church and closed most of the country's monasteries, thus forcing more dedicated breweries to open to keep up with the demand for beer. One of the main problems of early brewing was that beer didn't keep well. It soon spoiled, so it couldn't be exported or even traveled from town to town. This could be overcome to a certain degree by increasing the alcohol content, but that was very expensive and not practical for the time. In the 9th century, it was discovered that beer could be flavored with hops, and this would increase the longevity of the beer. But as with all great things, practice makes perfect, and it was difficult to get the recipe just right. But eventually, it paid off, and even though it took until the 13th century to fully perfect the process, a new tried-and-true standard was set. Once the Germans had broken through this barrier, they discovered that hopped beer lasted longer. They also introduced standard barrel sizes and started the export trade in beer. These technological leaps meant that beer was no longer a small-scale cottage industry, and up to 10 skilled specialist artisans were needed to run a German brewery. By the 14th century, this type of operation had spread through Holland and onto Flanders and Brabant. At this time, Brabant was under German control, so the use of hops was a mandatory requirement in the brewing of beer to ensure the purity was up to the required standard. Speaking of this required standard, in 1516, the Duke of Bavaria, William IV, introduced the purity law. This was perhaps the first European food regulation and heavily restricted the ingredients of beer to simply water, barley, hops, and nothing else. Yeast was only added to the list in 1857 after the French Louis Pasteur discovered germ theory of fermentation. Although the importance of yeast in the brewing process was very much understood centuries prior to this, the purity law was a legal requirement for the next 471 years. It was finally repealed in 1987. Although hops were becoming increasingly popular and were insisted on by German brewers, there was actually quite a degree of resistance to using them, especially among religious groups. The French tradition used herbs such as coriander and licorice, spices such as ginger, and fruits such as cherries and raspberry to flavor their brews. While many monastic brewers in Belgium continued with this practice because they regarded hops as the fruit of the devil. For better or for worse, beer making took some big steps forward during the Industrial Revolution. Emerging technologies like steam power and refrigeration led to tastier, more consistent, and easier to brew beverages. Industrialization and globalization also paved the way for widespread consolidation of the modern beer industry. And because of this, mass-produced beer made from hops, grain, and yeast is the standard today. But the brews of the past haven't disappeared completely. Resurrecting ancient beer recipes has become a popular pastime among homebrewers, and even some commercial breweries have joined in on the trend. So next time you grab a beer, take a second. Appreciate that you're grabbing a liquid that very much connects you to the origins of civilization itself. Cheers, and I'll see you in the next one.